Horsepower has gotten absolutely meaningless nowadays. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that all of us should flock to buying a Ford Focus S like this with its 160 Shetland pony power or whatever it is? I doubt it's horses. Well, no. But what it does mean is what we perceive as a lot of horsepower, or the amount of super high horsepower related content that we consume nowadays, is just absolutely crazy and has skyrocketed from the past. Let's go ahead and talk about what that means. For instance, in the tuning world, the internet really has absolutely destroyed any perception of what is a fast car. I say this not just to defend my own car or something like that, but this is a 400 horsepower car stock. Mine has a few modifications. It probably has a little bit more than that, but I've never dynoed it to say for sure. But let's be clear, 400 horsepower is not a slow car, but 400 horsepower has drastically changed in the level of what used to be a really high amount of power to where now that's pretty close to ground level, which is absolutely crazy to think about. But in years past, and not so long ago, even modifying on the aftermarket a base level car up to around 400 wheel horsepower was considered really impressive. That was considered a very formidable amount of power. And with something like that, you were probably faster than the vast majority of cars that you would come in contact with on the street. But that just isn't the case anymore. Times have moved on, and just type into YouTube 1,000 horsepower Supra, 2,000 horsepower Supra, 3,000 horsepower GTR, 3,000 horsepower Corvette, whatever, the list goes on. The amount of content based on these just crazy amounts of power is massive. It is so easy to consume, and it is really easy to get a skewed perspective of what is actually fast and what is just honestly insane. And I say this because I've known a lot of people that are either fairly young and are just starting to show an interest in cars, or people that just in general, at whatever stage in their life they're in, have started showing an interest in cars, and they've said something to me along the lines of, like, with whatever car they buy, that, like, you know, they just want to do some basic bolt-ons, whatever it takes to get them up to like 700 wheel horsepower or something like that. And let me just tell you, there is very few cars that exist that basic bolt-ons will take you up to 700 horsepower at the wheels. But with the amount of times we see things pushing like 1,000, 1,200 horsepower, whatever it is, 700 horsepower, that doesn't seem particularly crazy, but it is crazy, because let's go ahead and talk about the OEMs and what sort of power levels have historically been available from a stock car straight out of the factory in years past up to today. For instance, the huge bumps in power from one generation to the next, or one power plant to the next, in the same model level car from year to year is crazy. For instance, my car is a 2011 Ford Mustang GT. It is the first year of the Gen 1 Coyote 5.0. In stock, it has 412 horsepower. But what's crazy is when you think about the fact that one model year before this car, it was pushing 315 horsepower. There was a 97 horsepower bump from one year to the next with these cars. And not just for the V8, but even the base level V6 went from 210 horsepower, I believe, to 307. Also a 97 horsepower bump. And the most recent version of the Coyote 4.0 in the S650 Mustangs, or even the latest Gen 3 Coyotes that you could find in, for instance, the Bullet S550s or the Mach 1s, push 480 horsepower. The already monumental 97 horsepower bump of this car has then been bumped up again, not so many years later, realistically, 68 more horsepower. That is a very substantial amount of power that has steadily been increasing. But that's just one example. Consider in later 2014, when the 2015 model year Hellcats were released onto the world, and when everyone went absolutely nuts for them. Now, for some people that weren't around the car scene at that time, or just maybe didn't pay that much attention, it might not seem as crazy in retrospect. A 700 horsepower car, there's a lot of cars nowadays that are pushing power levels close to those, most of which are still much more expensive, but that number is not exactly as untouchable as it seemed like it was in the past. But don't forget that at that time, 700 horsepower, that was a number that you just didn't get unless you were buying something crazy like a Lamborghini Aventador with its 6.5 liter V12. And that's a car that would cost you $400,000 plus at the time, and the Hellcats were selling for about 70. That sort of power had never existed for that price point, and they just kept pushing it further. The Hellcat Red Eye and the most recent versions of the Dodge Challengers, like the Last Call and all these different models that I can't keep up with, have pushed 807 horsepower. And let's not forget the Dodge Demon that pushed 840 horsepower. Now, it's not like these cars are inexpensive, but for the price that they are at, which is generally something that is attainable for a person that is fairly well-to-do, that level of power is crazy. Just a few years before, the very, very top-level Mustang GT500 in 2012 was a 500 horsepower car. The top-level Mustang you could get from Ford. Or there was the ZL1 Camaro in, I believe it was 2012 when that was released as well, for the 5th gen Camaro that was pushing 580-ish horsepower from the factory. And yet the Hellcat comes out a few years later putting an additional 200 or 120 horsepower on the competition. That is crazy. But in years past, we've seen so many other cars pushing crazy power like that, it kind of takes away the weight of just how much power that really is to handle. Cut to literally any video ever of someone spinning out or crashing a Hellcat or a GT500 or whatever it may be. That is a ton of horsepower for an untrained person, because any person can go and buy one of these cars from a dealership. But that doesn't mean that any person can handle that level of power necessarily. But what's crazy to me is that the horsepower wars, they're far from over, because with the rise of EVs, the floor of acceptable power is absolutely jumping so much higher than ever before. There are enthusiast level or super high up super or hyper cars that are just pushing absurd amounts of power with the new battery power plants. For instance, even just the Kia EV6 GT, which is a car that, although again not super cheap, is relatively affordable for the most part, and is pushing nearly 600 horsepower straight out of the factory. You go slightly more expensive than that with a Tesla Model S or Model X Plaid, they're pushing over 1,000 horsepower equivalent. And if you go up to the unlimited level, we're seeing cars like the Lotus Evija and the Rimac Navara pushing nearly 2,000 horsepower. Now, obviously those aren't cars that almost anyone is ever going to get their hands on, but the fact that cars that are relatively affordable for the most part, if you're a person that is generally reasonably wealthy in one way or another, it's gonna be a drop in the bucket to afford a Kia EV6 GT or a Tesla Model S Plaid. But the thing is, even base level EVs are fast now. We see a lot of really fairly affordable base level family EVs that are pushing 300 or 400 or sometimes nearly 500 horsepower. And that's what I mean when I say that the floor of acceptable performance is skyrocketing, because what used to be considered fast and a high level of horsepower to the general consumer at around 400 horsepower is slowly just becoming the norm that people expect basically any car to perform at or around. And this really makes it interesting for car enthusiasts like us. Obviously, we like fast cars. I bought my Mustang because even at its 400 horsepower, that doesn't seem crazy nowadays, it is the fastest car that I have ever personally owned. With EVs just becoming faster and faster, even at a fairly low level nowadays, speed is not going to be at a premium. Speed is going to be something that is just around, is easy to achieve, easy to find. So what is that going to do for the car enthusiast. Is that going to ruin car enthusiasm? Well, no, but I do think that there will be a shift in perspective for car enthusiasts. When you don't have to go looking for speed, what else are you going to look for when it comes to enjoying a car? Well, I think that we're going to see a huge resurgence in cars on the used market that offer something that an EV can't, like a more in-depth, a more feelsome driving experience, if you know what I mean. The sort of driving sensation that you get from something like a Honda S2000 or even a Mazda Miata, or on the further up level, something like a Lotus Elise or a Porsche 911, something that is just incredibly driver focused and with the just sort of feel of being connected to the machine that seems to have kind of gone missing with even enthusiast-oriented EVs. If outlawing gas-powered cars does actually happen on the timetables that it seems like a lot of the governments are currently expecting, cars like this, they might be a thing of the past way sooner than we would like to believe. And honestly, I think that is going to make a ripe used market for these cars. That is, unless, and it really leaves us with the question, will EV manufacturers continue to try and make enthusiast-oriented cars? But not just enthusiast-oriented in the fact that they are fast, because that's something that's honestly really easy to achieve nowadays with battery technology and motor technology being so advanced and continuing to advance every single year. Obviously, we see that car enthusiasts are a market that can make money. If it wasn't, then there would be no car manufacturers that made any enthusiast cars. But what we see is that right now, we're at the kind of end of a golden era of every car manufacturer making an enthusiast-oriented car. So, will that continue as we go further into EV manufacturing? Will EV manufacturers make EVs that are more driver-oriented rather than just being directly speed-oriented? We've already seen that you can obviously make an EV extremely fast, but we've yet to see a really clear example, especially at a more affordable level, of an EV that is designed to be a great driver's car. So it'll be really interesting to see if that is something that does end up happening. So with that, I would love to hear you guys' thoughts in the comments if you have any opinions about this topic. Obviously, EVs seem like they're what's happening. I totally understand not being super interested in EVs. I love my engines and just having fun with a rowdy V8 car or whatever it may be. Internal combustion engines are always going to have a special place in my heart personally, but please let me know your thoughts, and if you did enjoy this video, please consider subscribing to the channel for more content like this, as well as more car content relating to my personal car, my Ford Mustang GT, and I will see you guys all in the next one.